Oh, hello there. Yes, well, good grief, a new week. My cat is confirming its sort of libertarian tendencies by flatly refusing to wear an Elizabethan collar, although I have pointed out that's going to leave him feeling a little bit rough. Sorry I had to do that. Anyway, yesterday was the usual reform fest in our political circles, and as ever, Reform TV was interviewing Richard Tice, a man who has definitely been undergoing media training because he's getting a bit better at these things. The Reform Party have decided to take a legal route vis-a-vis migrants in their local areas, which number one, I don't think is going to work, and number two, would set an interesting precedent because does that mean, therefore, for example, that Greens or Lib Dems or indeed other councillors can just flatly refuse to do what the central government wants? I mean, you can try it if you like, but I'm not convinced, really. And we have allegedly had an inkling of what exactly reform will do. Ironically, behind a paywall, in the Mail, you can read about Nigel Farage and all the great things he's going to do and how radical it is. Cough, cough. Except it just looks like exactly what the Tories have been saying for about the last 5 years. In real terms, we're going to leave the ECHR, we're going to tackle the small boats, and we're going to help the farmers, we're going to get rid of inheritance tax, and we're going to do something fiddly with oil or whatever it might be. It's very kind of Liz Trussy, probably, yeah, we've tried that over and over and over again, and it basically won't work. It's not realistically a radical manifesto for change. It's the Tory party, but you can safely assume that we'll be meaner about migrants. I mean, if you read the comments under the Camilla Toomey interview with Richard Tice, their core vote is definitely there because they can't stand her because she's way too woke for them, which is just so deeply ironic for somebody that writes op-ed pieces for the Telegraph. Anyway, moving on from that, the whole thing about perhaps the notion of parties having a strategy is, well, almost all of them don't. I mean, there's nothing realistically between the Tories, the Labour, the Lib Dems to a certain extent at all at the moment. You might argue there are inklings of things happening in the Green Party, but even then there's very little that's really there, and you have to say to yourself, well, what exactly are we going to do about the issues there are, of which there are loads? I mean, I was struck at the weekend with various ongoing stories about schools, private schools closing because of the dreaded Labour VAT, to which you can now add the dreaded Labour NI contributions and making staff too unaffordable. But speaking as somebody who, has actually run schools, when you look at these small enterprises, they are economically unviable. I mean, there was this one in Wales, for example, which is actually owned by a larger chain, but my inkling is that despite what the larger chain might want to say, because obviously it doesn't really want to have to deal with various things with the Labour government, but leaving that aside, I mean, despite what they say, it's economically unviable. These kind of places with too large a catchment area that aren't going to take boarding pupils are just going to go to the wayside. You can't charge £12,000 a year with like a school with 100 kids in it. It's just economically unviable. So, these big companies, of which Cognito is one, or Cognia, sorry, should call them that, is one, are just simply not going to be bothered. And this is where we come down to the notions, if you like, of a proper strategy, a proper idea about what you might do. Because if you're not going to import cheap labour from abroad, and you're not going to basically have any form of real strategy around education, other than, we'll bring back VAT stuff, we'll take off the VAT again to private schools, that's great. But you just end up with this concentration of wealth, which is effectively in international companies who don't give a flying one about whether or not they hang on to schools in the UK. The land is worth a lot more, and they will asset strip quite happily, and their particular company has a long history of treating its workers like dirt, because if, of course, those profit margins are squeezed, then, well, they won't be, because what they'll do is simply employ less staff, hence the whole thing with, if you like, Reform and their backers saying, oh, well, we need to get rid of this regulation. What that basically means is we just don't want to pay staff anymore because it might affect our bottom line of profitability, and lots of schools will close. Now, we were told that all of these schools were going to close, and it would cause a major crisis this year, but all of the news coming out about people selecting schools as they do at this time of year for their kids in September is that there isn't any such thing. So the debate, of course, has now moved on to SEN education, and I would imagine that that's going to become a major battleground, primarily because, of course, an awful lot of local council's budget is now tied up in SEN provision, and Reform, being the, friend of the disabled everywhere, cough, cough, will of course be eyeing that quite greedily. Hence the, we need to deregulate, because that's what those things mean. It simply means spending less money. But then one has to say, well, where exactly will this money that we've saved go? Well, the answer is it will go in tax cuts, won't it? So we can all be better off, because after all, if we get our tax cuts, then we'll invest in British industry, and therefore we'll achieve that magical growth like what we've had for the last 40 years. Because every time tax cuts go to, us, then that's what happens, isn't it? Because that's the economic model. I mean, the fact that it doesn't work doesn't ever seem to percolate through to people like Camilla, asking possible questions of people like Richard, who, despite his media training, still struggles to realistically come up with how exactly any of this stuff is going to work, because it doesn't add up at all. Now, we could have, a sensible kind of joined up industrial strategy, which would, at least in part, prioritise the needs of working people, like Reform say they are. But we are a hell of a long way short of anything like that from any of the political parties, and I would include the Greens in that. We'll see about their new leadership, maybe not, but it's just an absolute desert of ideas. Yes, anyway, do have a lovely beginning to the week. I will hopefully have a much happier cat once he starts to be on the mend. I hate having to worry about small creatures, be they children or otherwise. I'm getting too old for that kind of thing. Anyway, do enjoy.